so we're really excited. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I just don't want anyone to think I was giving weird thumbs up to anybody. So good evening. Hi, welcome to the second annual Gary Parent Meeting tonight. For those of you who have joined us before, welcome back. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time at one of our Gary Parent Meetings, welcome. We're really excited to have you here. My name is Julianne Reynoso. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Elementary Education, and it is a proud evening tonight to have a very special guest with us. Dr. Sandra Kaplan will be our star speaker tonight. But before I begin, I just want to say thank you to all of you for supporting our programs, our services, and most importantly, our very special children here in PUSD. But without further ado, I am going to actually turn the mic over to our local GATE expert, Karen Anderson. She is a wonderful asset to PUSD. She's been servicing all of our schools, K-12. She's working with our teachers. Those of you who are in the audience that are fabulous teachers, if you haven't called upon her yet, please do so. Parents, if you have any questions, please never hesitate to give us a call. But without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Karen Anderson to introduce our fabulous speaker tonight.
Thank you. Welcome. So it is my honor to welcome Dr. Kaplan to Pasadena Unified School District tonight. She has worked with Pasadena over the years in different iterations, and in 2009, one of the Javits grants, which is a federal education grant, Pasadena Unified was one of the schools that got the benefit of some of that research and some of that work, so she worked with teachers then and continues to work with them. So I have to tell a little story about Dr. Kaplan. So I went through the master's program at USC, and Dr. Kaplan was my professor. And one of the closing interview, I think, when we had to, where I'm all nervous because I got to answer all the questions correctly to be able to get my teacher school certificate. And she said, Karen, you should really think about teaching teachers. Now, I haven't even started teaching yet, okay? So this is a person who sees potential in everyone she comes across. She sees potential in 4-year-olds, in 3-year-olds, in early childhood, and in every single student that walks into her classroom at the graduate level, whether it be for a master's degree or a PhD, and can see, here's a pathway that I see for this particular student. She has driven me in my career to challenge me to try things that I never would have expected I would try. I won't even go into all of those, and continuously motivated me to be a better teacher, whether that's of children or of adults, and to dig deeper into what's really happening in our schools to make them more equitable and to really reveal potential in every student and in every teacher out there. So that's one little anecdote. I will give a quick bio. Dr. Kaplan is a professor of clinical education at the University of Southern California, and she's been the principal investigator for 4 projects funded by the Jacob Javits grant from the Talented Student Education Act in the Department of Education. Each of these projects focused on gifted and talented economic, linguistic, and culturally diverse students in Title I K-8 California schools. Dr. Kaplan has been an international and national consultant for districts, state departments, and other educational agencies to provide professional development in the areas of differentiated curriculum and instruction. She's written over 40 articles and 10 books related to identifying and providing appropriate educational services to gifted students. Currently, Dr. Kaplan is an active member and past president of the California Association for the Gifted. She has much recognition for her work, receiving awards for excellence from the Council for Exceptional Children, the National Association for the Gifted, and for service and achievement, and research awards from the California Association for the Gifted. And I have one little anecdote before I pass it over. So I have a third grade son, and he had got, the flyer from his school about this that went to his parent, and he said, Dr. Kaplan, he knows Dr. Kaplan. He says, I see her everywhere. Everything, always talking about Dr. Kaplan. He said, what does she do? And I said, well, those prompts in your classroom that your teacher uses and that you all use to help dig deeper into content and, all the different things that you think about. And she invented those. And he said, whoa, this is what he said, I'm not kidding. He said, whoa, multiple perspectives. So he applied the prompt in me talking about Dr. Kaplan, and he was incredibly impressed that you're an inventor. So anyway, with that, her work has been in schools all over the world, and the impact on teachers and children is vast. So it is with great honor that I present Dr. Sandra Kaplan.
It's always nice to have something else happen to you when you are a teacher, and I think all of you probably feel the same way about your own children, and that is that it's nice to see somebody that's matriculated through a program that you knew intimately do so well, and the district is exceptionally lucky to have Karen. Absolutely, she's a wonderful educator, and I think one of the things I take in value about Karen is that we talk a lot about change agentry. And we say in our classes, we want you to become a change agent and do things that will really make a difference. And Karen not only talks about it, she lives that role. So it is a pleasure that I could be here with you. I'm going to talk, as Karen and I discussed, about intellectualism and the idea of the intellectual struggle and the idea of looking at giftedness just a little bit different than I think most often people do. I see giftedness as on a continuum from something that has a tremendous amount of assets to something that has a tremendous amount of liability. And so I'd like to kind of share with you that continuum in terms of looking at what really is giftedness, what it is not, and what it could be. And what can we do to really improve the status of gifted children? And we know that there's curriculum, we know that there's pedagogy, but there's also a way of interacting. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about with one, I hope, thing that I'd like you to think about, and that is please feel free to ask questions while we're talking. If there's something that doesn't seem to be particularly clear, let me go through the process of being able to clarify it here. Or if there's something that you see and want more information about, please ask a question. Or if there's something you disagree with, please let us know, because that will give us a chance to elaborate and really extend what we're talking about. So one of the things that I think is kind of interesting, and I have tremendous amounts of arguments with in terms of my colleagues, is that sometimes we don't really understand and help the kids understand what we mean by challenge or academic rigor or the idea of differentiation. So I never forget one of the first kind of experiences I had with gifted children, which is kind of interesting. I love to tell this story because it's such a happenstance event. I was assigned to a school. I taught in the Inglewood Unified School District the first year that I taught. And I knocked on the door in a very, very timid way. And this man answered the door and said, "Yes?" And this was, somewhere in August. And I had been on the Santa Monica Beach getting tan and thought that maybe I should go and look at where I was going to be teaching. So, I kind of had myself a little bit dolled up with my tan. And he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I'm going to be teaching here." And he said, "Oh, I'm the new principal here." I mean, he was as fearful of me as I was of him. And so I said, "What grade?" And he said, just a minute. And he looked and he said, "Oh, okay, here's how it's going to go." And maybe some of you remember, do you remember cume folders? Okay, so there were stacks of cume folders that were out there, and he said, "Okay, here's the stack that nobody wants." And he said, the other principal said that these are the ones that you can, in fact, choose from. And so I said, "Oh, okay, I'll take that one." It was a second, third grade class of gifted kids. And I had no understanding of really what that meant. So it's kind of interesting because these words meant little to me, honestly. I want to just talk a minute about Billy. When I said to Billy, "I want to challenge you," he said, "Don't bother. I can do it myself." And I thought, here I'm trying to help this child. And, I thought, how come we sound a little bit more gracious? Well, for some of our students, the challenge is more work. It's more difficult. It also separates them out. And so we don't do enough to really help explain what a challenge really is. That a challenge is not a penalty because you happen to be capable. A challenge is to really recognize your capability and want to extend it. And so if I can give an analogy in terms of sports, if in fact the coach said to you, "Hey, I'd really like to challenge you by putting you in this position this game," I don't think most kids would say, "No, not me." They'd say, "Really? Okay, here I go." And so we need to help to really explain what we mean by these words. The word differentiation, I think, is not only an interesting word for kids to understand, but I think it's a really important word for parents to understand. Differentiation is far, far different than what differentiation is sometimes led people to believe. We're not talking about making the curriculum different. We're talking about how do we differ it? What do we do when you're teaching what everybody else needs to learn to really tantalize the potential or the particular ability of a child? And I had a parent call me once. I tell the story often. Poor Karen's heard it 100 times. Who said to me, my kid has been identified the gifted program is studying the gold rush like everybody else. And I said, oh, that's great. I'm glad. That's important. No, you don't understand. My child is studying the gold rush like all the other fourth graders. And I said, that's what we want the child to do. It's how you approach it, what you do with it, what, in fact, you can do to kind of mold it, like you mold Play-Doh or clay, so that it matches the child. But I'm not going to say because you're gifted, you don't have to learn about the gold rush, because that's part of what we anticipate everyone should be learning. So we need to talk about this, and we need to talk about it in a way that I think really helps students understand what we're really talking about in terms of services and what we really are trying to do to really help you. And so here's some of the other things that I get, I think, a little bit concerned about. And that is, I don't think it's important in and by itself to be intelligent. And don't misunderstand, intellectualism is a concomitant of intelligence. But just to be intelligent is not enough. I know lots of intelligent people who are not intellectual. Intellectuals are people who can use information, not just regurgitate it, who understand that there are nuances in the information that might put them into another kind of way of looking at something. And so there are some things about intellectual development I'd like to share with you. One is that you need to understand what intellectual stamina is. I find it fascinating that the same child that can play Minecraft over and over again, in essence, gets really, I'm bored when we say, well, think about taking this sentence and rewriting it. It's still building, it's still architecture, it's still creating. It's a little bit different instead of the material you're working with, but I don't think we've helped kids understand that boredom is a state of mind. It is not in the material. It's in the individual. So how do we develop intellectual stamina? And how do we develop, for example, intellectual humility? Intellectual humility is, I don't need to know this, I already learned it. Really, then in what way can you see it in another way? It reminds me very much, I love going to the museum. And I've studied this, okay? So there are the people that stand right in front of the painting and just look at it. And then they'll say, oh, I like it or I don't. I was at LACMA and I was looking at the Impressionists, and I happen to be very, very interested in one particular artist and get a little bit upset when people stand there and don't appreciate what I think is important. But this person's standing right in front of it and says, oh, nothing particularly interesting here. I don't get it. But that's not how you look at it. You need to look at it here. You need to look at it, over here. You need to look at it way over here. You need to see it from all different angles. And then you can say what you really know. And then you can still say, I still don't see it all. I've seen it so many times, but I still don't see it all. So it's that intellectual humility of not feeling so arrogant that because you passed by it once, you know it, or because you read it once, you know it. And so we were talking the other day about, I was with some friends, and we were talking about books we'd read when we were kids. And one of my friends who's retiring said, you know what my goal is? She said, don't tell anyone. What is it? She said, I'm going to read all those children's books again because they're going to mean something different now than they did when I was 13 or 14, etc. And that's the humility of it. And it's the idea also of being able to have intellectual integrity, to be able to say, I don't know this. I don't know this. I'm teaching, I was telling Karen, I'm teaching a class right now, and it has, it's K-12, people that are, going to be teaching high school as well as middle school as well as elementary school. And I was reading this lesson on trigonometry. Now, between you and me, I didn't do very well in trigonometry. I memorized what I could do to get the grade to pass. Okay, to this day, I don't know what it is really. in terms of actually being able to use it. I know what it is as a conceptual idea. And I'm reading this lesson, and I said to the student, this is a really excellent lesson, but I can tell you how you wrote it, but I really can't tell you about the essence of what you put into it, because the calculations I really don't understand. And he looked at me and says, but I thought you were, you're a professor. Yeah, I profess curriculum pedagogy. I don't know it all. I don't know it all. And I think that sometimes our gifted kids don't have the integrity to really raise their hand and say, I don't get this. And I think also, in all honesty, sometimes our teachers are not willing to listen to that. What do you mean you don't know that? I thought you were gifted, kind of thing. So we have to be careful. I think the other thing I just want to talk a little bit more about is the intellectual struggle, and that it is a struggle. I don't know how much you've read. How many of you saw Genius when it was on last fall, I guess it was? It's the 10 episodes of Einstein. Yeah, did it come that easy to him? No. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? And yet when I mention it to people about, gee, he really struggled. He not only struggled with the social interactions, but he struggled with the body of knowledge itself. And they said, really? He struggled? And then how many of you saw, Madame Curie, the new movie that just came out? Well, a new rendition of it. 22 years? No, I'm sorry. How many kids do you know that would spend 22 years on a problem? And we don't allow that to happen. Because if we don't get the immediate satisfaction, then we say, well, you must not be that smart. As opposed to, how fabulous that you have an interest that's intense enough that you can stick to it. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about intellectualism and not just the idea of being intelligent. There are many different points of view. You're listening to mine. Not all of us agree. And so that's part of the fun of it, okay? So look at what I have to say, then listen to what others have to say, and, kind of come to your own about what this really means. But there are some things that we're saying that we want for our students, and what we want for our students is to become scholars. And I was just reading an article, and it's an old article by Elliot Eisner, and he said there's something wrong with just looking at that score from an experience rather than what does we learn about ourselves from the experience as a scholar. And so let's think about this. Scholars are people that ponder. They don't try to get the answer right away. So to have your hand up before the teacher even finishes the question, it's not what we're talking about. Or not to be able to say, I'll have to think about this. I'll come back to it. The ability to really understand how to stick to the task. The idea, again, perseverance, the idea of, intellectual stamina, the idea that we don't hit and run. And that's also related to practice. And so I just met a student who was telling me that he's embarrassed to tell anybody how much he really practices. And so I was telling him my great story. Again, poor Karen's heard it. I was in the doctoral program at UCLA, and I decided I would take a week off work to study. And my colleagues in the program said, are you serious? How can you do that? I said, I'm taking a week off work to study for the exams. And they said, oh, that's such a waste of time, I can't believe it. When we met a couple of hours before it was time to take the test, many people boasted, I didn't study, didn't open up a book. And I said, I studied, I'd open up books, and not only that, but I ate probably several boxes of candy, seized candy by the pound, just to make sure that I had, given myself the kind of reward that I needed. And it was very, very interesting. When, in fact, the grades came through and some people didn't do as well as they had anticipated, et cetera, one person came up to me and said, I didn't study because I thought that I was too smart to study. This is an adult. This is an adult. And he didn't pass. So one of the things we really want to look at is, why did we take away the fact that studying is really an important attribute? To practice something is not demeaning. It should be really exhilarating. It should be able to give you another point of view that maybe you hadn't seen before. So we talk about these things, and we also talk about the fact that at some point or other you take a risk. If you're not really good at writing, then you push yourself to try to write. If you're not really good, like I, in math, you push yourself a little bit harder. so that you can at least, kind of move beyond it. So some things to talk about, some things to really kind of ponder. I think one of the things that we're missing with many of our gifted kids is reading biographies and autobiographies. I think if they read more about how other people were successful, it's not just a straight line. It's not that you're identified with potential and then all of a sudden you are, realizing your potential. There's lots of steps in between. And so here are some of the steps. One is that underachievement may mean that you've been undertaught. And it's not just the teacher's fault. I've seen children that will start to do the work before it's completely explained, or think they don't need the explanation because I already know that. And then they don't do well, and then, who am I going to blame? In some ways, we need to really look at the fact that if you're not doing as well as your potential would enable you to do, you need to look at what you're doing to underteach yourself or to be in a situation where you're not being taught well. And then that means you raise your hand. You ask a question. You spend the time and say, I need to talk to somebody because this needs to be clarified. So many of our students who don't do well are too embarrassed to seek the help they need to do well because somebody said you're gifted. And that's not what giftedness is. Giftedness doesn't mean that you're excused from teaching or from learning. It means that you may need even more of that. And so here are some of the pedagogical things that we want to think about. We want to make sure that students understand how to go from the simple to the complex, conversely, from the complex to the simple. And so I think that there are times when I'll see children really try to find the hardest way to do it, and then they miss some of the points that are really very, very blatant and could in fact make it easier for them to really use their potential and gain another level of understanding. And along the same lines, I really worry that we always don't go from the concrete to the abstract, that sometimes we go from the abstract to the concrete. So I've had people say to me, you can't do that, when I'll say to a teacher, as Karen well knows, something like, let's not talk about the facts first. Let's talk about the big idea. Instead of talking about all the facts and then adding it all up to the big idea, let's do it deductively. Let's start and say, today's lesson, we're going to try to prove that power can be covert or overt. All day long, in science, in language arts, in mathematics, in history, we're going to try to prove this big idea. And what will happen is some kids say, that doesn't make sense. I know. That's what we're going to try to find out. As opposed to always saying, first we'll collect all the facts, and then we'll look at that big idea. So how do we keep changing the pattern? So in changing the pattern, you learn the many different ways of rooting yourself to your potential, to your ability, to your talent. I mean, there's not just one way to drive from your house here. There are lots of different ways to do it. Some are better than others, but basically one of the things that we want to do is show that there are multiple roads. Do we have a
And I wanted to add to that, and this is one of the things that we can have conversations with our children about. So, you never get an answer when you say, what did you learn today? Or what did you do today? They'll go, nothing, whatever. But you can say, well, tell me something that was interesting that you found out today. And then you start to take these little pieces and go, so what does that all add up to? What does that tell you about change? What does that tell you about the power struggles today that you experienced? Because sometimes the things that are interesting might be, this kid did this thing, and then this other kid responded in this way. How interesting. So what does that tell you about this conflict of power between these two people that you're around? So we're taking those little pieces and we're bringing them to a more abstract. And then they go, oh, that's interesting. So what else? Where else did you think about power today? And it might take it in another place. So we can gather, like little detectives, little pieces of information through the types of questions we ask the kids to then say, are they thinking about things abstractly? Are they thinking about things concretely? And how can we allow for some fluidity between those two pieces?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, Karen just sparked to me some things I'd like to share with you. One is the concept of magic, and as it relates to magical ability. So one reason that students don't change, gifted students in particular, don't change their pattern for learning is because somehow they believe that giftedness is magical, and if in fact they have shifted a way in which they've done work that they hadn't done before, somehow that magic will leave. Incidentally, it's hard to explain to a child what we mean by giftedness. And many kids will ask, so where did that come from? Is it something I ate? And sometimes we'll say, you're just lucky. Well, what does that mean? And I'll never forget a child saying to me, well, when will my luck, kind of go away? It's a genetic endowment. It's a matter of experience. It's a matter of luck, okay? And incidentally, I didn't make that up. I wish I had. But this is the work of a man named Tannenbaum, who was trying to desperately explain giftedness. And his ideas are that part of it's heredity, that's the way it is. Part of it is environment, that's the way it is. And part of it is unadulterated luck, that's the way it is. Like in a family, one child has curly hair, the other one has straight hair. Why me? We have the same genetic endowment, you have this, more or less, you have the same environment, those are the things that happen. The second thing that I think is really interesting is the fear. And there's two different kinds of fears. There is the fear of failure, which all of you know what that feels like. But there's also the fear of success. And we have gifted kids that are more fearful of this than they are of failure. Because every success breeds the anticipation of another success. And so I don't think any of us really sometimes know the pressure that that really includes, nor do we try to ameliorate it by saying to a kid, look, a success in this area doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have success in all areas. That, as a task become differentiated or differing, then we have different kinds of success in different ways. The other one is not me. And I could give you all the psychological variables behind this, but basically what it is the idea that I want desperately, as a parent, to have become a doctor, an engineer, and that's what I expect you to do. So we cast on to the other what it is that we didn't. I mean, I still remember that, and I loved my parents dearly, but my father had this idea about his daughter taking chemistry. And I remember sitting there in high school looking at that long thing. Do you remember that long thing? And thinking, that's cute, but I'm not sure I want to know what all that's about. And, my father used to say, I'd love to have been a chemist. I think that would be wonderful for you. And that's sweet, and it was meant with good intention, of course. But we need to be careful that that's not what happens. These are three really important factors that mitigate against some of the freedom to really start to accept, what you're capable of and what, in fact, is differing at different times. We have, if you, again, think about this as a continuum. So, and think about this as math, all right? So in some situations, you can be here with the people who are ready to go. And, oh my gosh, how come they don't get it? I get it. I'm ready to go. Sometimes we're just ready, okay? Yeah, I get it. I'm not so comfortable, but I get it. And sometimes we're not ready. It could be the same student. It could be the same gifted math student. Some of this is situational. And we get so upset. What do you mean? What do you mean you don't get it? How can you get it here and not get it there? My uncle was a professor at the med school and in Canada. And one of the things that he tried to explain to me, it took me a while to get it, was he said, we get all the kids who are ready to go to come to the med school. And then they have the audacity to reorganize themselves. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, because then we have the ready to go. We have the one that are just ready to go. And then we have the not yet ready to go. Yet they were all ready to go at one time. So we have to think about the situational aspects or the contextual aspects that really govern, the ways in which our gifted students see things, internalize things, and achieve. So I want to show you some things that we can be doing, though, at home. One of the things that we can do is we can teach anybody, I do believe this, and you can argue with me, but I don't think you'll get me to move. I think we can teach anybody anything. Given enough time, we can teach anybody anything. But there is a sequence, and that sequence is kind of interesting. First, you have to have some personal connection to it. Secondly, I think you need to have some kind of simulated experience with it. Third of all, I think you need to build on what you already know. Then you're ready for the new thing, and then you can move on in a variety of different ways. It's fascinating. What you as parents can do is work on these two areas. These are fabulous things to do. How many of us go out and really show the kids what's out there? You know, somebody said to me, well, you know, I'm good for you. But somebody said to me, well, our kids don't like the museum. That may not be a choice. That may not be a choice. Sorry. Museums are interesting. It's our job to go there and find out what's interesting. You know, somebody said, I asked somebody about taking their children to the Arboretum. I said, oh, I could just see my kid giving up soccer for the Arboretum. But wait a minute. You know, if you haven't been there once, how do you know that it's not worth going there to give up soccer? And I'm not saying soccer forever. And I'm not saying you have to become an ecological, you know, lover, nor do you have to become a conservationist. But if you don't know what's out there, there's nothing that can be built to really help to use that ability. So we've talked a lot about the idea of dabbling. I don't know how many of you dabble. Dabbling is kind of fun. Dabbling, let me just move my papers. I love moving my papers. Dabbling is the idea that you can see something and you can make some decisions. You can touch and go. I mean, I've taken cooking classes. I love the food they feed you at the end. Do I want to spend 17 hours making a whatever? No, but eating it is great fun. It's really fun. So, you know, you touch and you go. There are some things that, in fact, you linger a while. How many of you have done this? I mean, I was all in my life at one point wanted to knit. So I went and I took knitting lessons, and I thought, I'm going to make this afghan. We'll throw it around ourselves. Won't that be great on a cold day? And I did it for a while. I don't ever want to do it again. And so somebody will say, well, that was a waste of your time. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. I learned something really important about knitting. And, you know, but some things you can stay put. Some things you'll never give up. Never give up. And so I think, again, poor Karen's heard this story. I wanted desperately to draw, and this is about the best I can do, really. Although I could put some ears on it and a trunk, and you'd think it was an elephant. Hey, that's pretty cute. That's better than I usually do. But one of the things in an art class, and it was actually in college, the professor said to me, you know, Sandra, that's always a parenthetical phrase that you can listen to. You know, comma. You know, Sandra, you're going to make a great person who will appreciate art, but I don't know if you're going to be able to really be an artist. And so, yeah, I did learn how to appreciate art. There'll never be enough for me. Never. I could spend my days. You know how they have that movie where the kid gets lost in the museum overnight? I wish it would happen to me. Wouldn't that be great? But, you know, it doesn't happen to everybody in the same way. But unless you have visits, unless you've dabbled, then it doesn't go anywhere. And that's an important factor. Another important factor is to understand that there's not one way to do anything. I mean, there is maybe a best way, but there's not just one way. And so one of the things that we've been talking to the students about is that there are some fixed ends. You will learn how to write. You will learn how to multiply. You will learn how to do algebraic algorithms. You will learn about the history of whatever. But there are multiple means to get there. And that's, I think, what Karen and I have spent so much time with teachers talking about. You know, again, you were supposed to be here today. You drove here. We didn't tell you what car to take or drive in. We didn't tell you what road to take. All we said was be here by. And so we're trying to get more of this to happen. One of my biggest disappointments, and upon occasion, I have a tantrum, not a big one, but a tantrum, is when my students in the doctoral program will say to me, how many pages? How many references? You know, is this what you want?
What exactly do you want it to look like? Give me an exact rubric. Master's students we teach in the same program. drives me nuts. I said, this is exactly the opposite of what I'm trying to teach you to do with kids. So I am not going to tell you. I'm going to tell you, you have the prompt and that's it.
Yeah, and it's not to say that Karen and I are not saying that you shouldn't be compliant. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that, yes, you will write an essay. It will, in fact, have references. It will be done APA style. That's not the argument. The argument is there are different roads to get there. And you may, a child I just absolutely adore, we have a grant that is working with preschool and preschool kindergartners and first graders. And there's this fabulous kid that said to me, I want to tell you something. I said, sure, what do you want to tell me? He said, I wrote this story, this is a first grader. I wrote it backwards. I said, well, what do you mean? And I said, you mean the letters backwards? He said, no. He said, I wrote the ending first, and then I wrote the beginning. Don't tell the teacher. She has it on the board. It is. He was absolutely right. You know, first you get the theme, and then you get the characters, then you start the, And so I said to him, there are great authors that have written it backwards, who get an idea and know what the solution is, and then they build from there, but I won't tell the teacher. But we want, it's not being out of compliance. It's looking at the fact, we'll all get there. We'll all be able to take the test. We'll all be able to hand in the work. We'll all be able to do what is expected of us. But the road to get there will differ for us. And one of the things that I'm concerned about, and I've been harping about, is the idea, are we going to identify kids as gifted and then take the giftedness out of them? Or are we going to identify kids as gifted and maintain that giftedness and have it take on all kinds of dimensionality to it? And I think that there are people I meet who are, I can be sitting on the airplane, and someone will say, what do you do after we have this chit-chat over the peanuts that are in the little bag? We'll say that now it's biscotti on American Airlines. How do you like that? But anyway, one of the things that somebody said to me was, I was in the gifted program. I just flew back from Charlotte. And I said to him, oh, that's nice. And he said, I hated every minute of it. He said, they made me ungifted. And it was very interesting. They took away some of what he was able to do in terms of, because they wanted compliance. And they were trying to look at the fact that they wanted both fixed means and fixed ends, which is not what we're talking about. Okay, let me stop for a minute. And what kind of question or comments do you have? Please.
That's okay, thank you. So when I'm listening to you, it's a lot of my thought process, but when you approach an educator, they kind of struggle because they've also been taught a certain way. And so at home, I dedicate extra time to actually speak to my child and find out how her gate mind works, because I'm also gate, and we do not think the same. We do not process anything the same. We could be gate 24/7, it doesn't matter. And I, as a parent, have to find a way to connect with her. My other daughter, the older daughter, she's gate as well, but she's completely opposite from my younger daughter. So it makes it really hard, because even though they've had the same teachers in certain schools, it's still difficult for those educators to meet each gifted student on that individual basis. And I'm just wondering if the state of California has gotten anywhere involved in helping the teachers, because it's not about condemning a teacher who wasn't taught. It's about helping them. And most times as parents, we're frustrated and we just go in with the problem. Okay, fix this, or you're not doing this right, or how can my kid? There has to be that little leeway. And as parents, we're not also educated a lot. So I really appreciate this particular forum, but I'm just wondering if state of California has bought into the reality of this.
Well, so I'm not going to put it on the state of California. I'm going to put it on the parents, because basically, probably now, in my opinion, the state is allowing parents through LCAP to have a voice. And so, there is a way to get a voice. And as a matter of fact, you could probably, Julie, answer it far better than I, but the opportunity for having a voice is there. But I think we need to also be really clear about the fact that it's not just the teachers. We need to help kids exercise, their voice. And it's not, well, I'm not going to do it this way, but I was wondering if there's another way that I could think about this, or another way. And the other thing that we need to be real careful about is there are times when there is no argument, okay? So we need to I live that, and so do you. There are times when you do it exactly as you have to do it, because that's what the expectation is, for many reasons, both intellectual, emotional, social. There are times when you have a choice. And so teachers have to help kids understand that. And that's part of going to college. It's part of being in the work world. But there is an opportunity because of the way we have LCFF, Local Control Funding Formula, and LCAP. And I also think that one of the things that we need to look at is when we talk to teachers, asking teachers, when are the times when it has to be done with regularity and for the precision that is a demand for all kids, and when is it the time that there's some opportunity for individual differences. And then the other thing is, let's be honest, when you're looking at individual differences, let's be really clear. Sometimes it's adjustments just in time. Sometimes it's adjustments just in, and I don't mean it in a negative way, but it's adjustments in resources or references. Sometimes it's adjustments in the quantity. So, sometimes these are little minor adjustments, so everyone could be writing the same story, or the same essay or whatever, but maybe some kids have more time and some kids have less time. Maybe some kids have more sophisticated resources and some don't. So it doesn't have to be the fact that since we're all studying the gold rush, that we're all necessarily doing it in exactly the same way. But there are some other things that I'd like to really talk about. I really blame us as a populace, okay, not just teachers at all, that we demand grades and we demand points. And when I've said, even in our grant, when I've said, we're not going to give any grades, we're just going to give comments, then we've had parents say, no grade, no grade, so we get kind of caught in, trying to figure out how we evaluate. The only thing I want to say is that it must be at some point that we get away from just these grades or the number of points somebody gets, and we say that there's three things that are important. It's the performance, of course. It's also your participation and your self-perception of it. How much did you really put into it? What did you get out of it that gave you a different way of looking at yourself? And, here's a really other good example that we're trying to perpetuate, that there are 3 grades. There is the norm reference grade, okay? That's the way it is. We live in a norm reference society to some extent. We also need to look at the self-defined grade, and we also need to look at the grade of others. So in one project, a child could get an A from the norm referenced. A child could get a B from their own perception of, I didn't really do it as well. I mean, I know kids that get A's that haven't even matched what their ability is capable of. And then from others, a child might get an A too. But that it's not just a single perception or just a rubric that gives you some kind of response.
And this is the other place where we can have conversations with our kids, right? So it's not just about that grade, but then how did you feel about it? What did you put in? If you had to judge yourself in terms of your effort in this particular project, what do you think? And they're usually pretty honest. And usually they're pretty honest when they grade each other in group work. You'd think, oh, they're going to blame each other. They really don't. Like all that negative stuff that you think is going to happen, they're actually usually much harder on themselves than the teacher is. So that's another place we can sort of have those conversations with the kids to bring it around. And I think your comment is really interesting because, of course, every single gifted child is so different. That's why this is the old joke from people who have taught gifted kids for many years when teachers say, oh, you have it so easy because you have the gifted kids. Yeah, it's the opposite of that, because you really have 25. If you have a class of all gifted kids, or if you have a class with a cluster of 8 gifted kids, each one of those is on a completely different spectrum, a completely different place. Just like when Dr. Kaplan had the, ready to go kids, and within there's the complexity. So I think it's having those conversations and trying to see the world from those multiple perspectives, right? And trying to see each other's way of thinking and helping them to understand that that's what we're doing with your colleagues too. That's what you're doing with your friends in your classroom.
There are 3 things, and this is in the classic literature, so I wish I could say I could own it, but I don't. But one of the things that people have said, and there's volumes written about this, it's always been interesting to me that we don't enact it, that there are 3 important questions from any kind of lesson or from any learning experience. And obviously one is, what did you learn? Obviously. The other one is, what are you going to do with it? Now that you know that there's subject and predicate, so what? What does that mean? What are you going to do with it? And we need to ask kids about the usability of what they're learning. And the third one is, so what else would you like to know about it? And those should be some of the questions. And those are questions that you could ask at home. So great, I'm really glad that you did this, but what are you going to do with it? And, what else would you need to know? Yes, please, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question too, but before that happened, I wanted to say, be careful about using the jargon LCAP, because I'm not sure everybody understands that means Local Control and Accountability Plan, and that all of us could be active in that. So I want to have a plug, if I can, that there's a GATE parent rep at every school that reports to a committee with Karen, and we're learning better how to advocate for our kids with respect to LCAP, because there's more gifted kids than special needs kids in the district, and yet the special needs budget is over 10 times as much as for gifted kids. So anyway, that's one plug for the parent committee. I want to have a plug for Karen in respect to your question, because one of the things she's doing is going around and training more and more teachers to be GATE certified so they have more strategies to help our kids. And then to my question, I'm wondering about your pedagogical approach to this evening. What was going through your mind on the way in which you would do what you would do tonight?
I don't think I understand the question. Could you help me a little bit? In other words, how did I prepare for this?
Yeah, that's part of what I'm asking, especially in light of the parents here primarily being like the woman right here.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I want to challenge one thing that you said, though.
Yeah, go ahead. That'd be great. I wanted Karen to correct anything, too.
And that is that money is not the sole criterion for a good education for gifted kids. I'm sorry. I mean, I have been across the United States. I have also spoken about this in many state departments. It is not how much money you have. I've seen money that has gone through to buy stuff that hasn't made a difference. So it's not how much money. It's the kind of pedagogy that we really can get teachers to use that makes a difference. And yes, you need some money for professional development, et cetera. But buying stuff or having, taking field trips is not in and by itself what we're talking about. Yes.
I have a question related to that.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay, I'll restate it. Go ahead.
Because I want to know what you think about personal learning platforms that more and more schools are using now. And it helps advance kids, but I'm not so sure it helps differentiation in the way that you're defining differentiation.
So the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question is around personal learning platforms, of which there are many. And then also the idea we were talking about, I think this is a really interesting question that Mr. Poppleton brought up, which is sort of the pedagogical methodology of planning when we're teaching parents. Like, how do we go about that process of sort of planning, when teaching adults, which I think was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think there are several things. I think a lot of it has to do with where you are in your career, and I've been doing this, for a long time. I'm also very actively involved right now in trying to work with agencies to see if we can change the definition of giftedness in our state. And there are some other things that politically we're involved in looking at gifted education in terms of equity and so forth. So when I think about coming to a situation like this, I have one ease that I can do. I don't have to talk about all of the curricular and pedagogical things that I care so much about because Karen's here. And so that makes it very easy for me then to go through the process of talking about the things I think parents need to take more responsibility for within the context of their home or within their interaction in the schooling process. So that's how I prepared it. And I also, I think there's one other thing. I don't allow for a lot of, let me say it another way. I tend to be much more animate in addressing a group like this than I would if this were a seminar, because I feel very strong that if we don't say some things definitively, we don't get the kind of response, whether it be positive or negative. We need to have people become a little bit more responsive, you know, and feel a little bit more strong about what it is that needs to be done. And so that's another way to kind of prepare.
And then the personal learning platforms, there are so many varieties of
Yeah.
personal learning platforms. There is one that would like to pilot here at PUSD, which is the Renzulli interest-based platform, which is really interesting, and it really helps develop, kids develop a personal profile based on their interests, and then it takes them on different pathways of kind of independent study, which is really, really great. And it's been used, now it's online. It's been online for about 10 years. And the online program is much stronger now than it was originally. But it's been this system, the Renzulli system for interest-based learning, has been around for many, many years and is well researched. And so that's something that I'm interested in. Online work just to do online work and just for acceleration of like, okay, now I'm doing second grade work, now I'm doing third grade work, and I'm racing through it as fast as I can. I don't always see the value in just doing that. Because yes, especially in math, a lot of our kids can just keep plugging away. And boy, they're just all of a sudden they're doing 8th grade math, but do they really know what they're doing? So, you know, we have to be careful about what those platforms are.
Yeah, we need to be, I'm
yeah,
sorry, Karen, I beg your pardon. We just need to be very careful that good learning doesn't mean intellectual isolationism, okay? And really, one of the things that I have a colleague whose nephew has just been hired by Google. One of the things that they insist is that you work in a group, that interaction and that sharing, that talent team development, the collaboration, the idea of really understanding the fact that no one of us can do it alone, that there needs to be the collaboration of people and the different talents, potential, ability they bring. I don't want kids to just move through something without working at right angles. Incidentally, let me just talk a moment about that. The pedagogical practice of working at right angles was something that was developed years ago by a man named Cal Taylor. And one of the things that Taylor talked about was the idea that if this is the curriculum, okay, so whatever this is, if this is the study of the gold rush or the study of, algorithms, whatever, that we teach kids to think at right angles, that this becomes the fodder for all kinds of thinking. And so if this were, and I'm going to do math, okay, then the right angle thinking might take you on a whole journey to look at its implications in science and to look at more of the interdisciplinarity. Or if this were math, the right angle might take another student to start to look at what they've already learned in math, and they can make that intersection. The point being that you need to help kids learn how to learn. And many of the kinds of things that I've seen that are online are really more automatic, and they are more isolated intellectually than the kinds of demands that it could get with interaction. That doesn't mean that can happen, but right now I've seen very little of that. Okay, so go ahead, please.
Okay, so any other questions that we can answer? Because we absolutely want to honor the time, and it is 7 o'clock, so maybe we'll take one or two more questions.
But then I want to finish with some important thoughts.
Okay, exactly. Here's a question.
I'm just wondering what your opinion is about, so my son was just identified, thank you, I was thinking diagnosed, identified last year, so he's new to the program. And we are striving to be a mindset family. You can do anything, you love a challenge, you can learn anything. But we have not yet told him, you're gate. And we've kind of done that intentionally, And just wondering what your thoughts on that are. Are there pros and cons to telling a child that they've been identified?
Yeah, I think if you want to make a good analogy, it's like telling somebody that they're beautiful, and what does that really mean? The literature is very, very clear about, in many ways, about telling a child what giftedness is and what it is not. So giftedness is what Tannenbaum has talked about. It's the idea that through heredity, environment, and luck, that you have this potential. We need to define what potential is or what ability is. So, one of the things that you might say, I was a tall kid. I may have had the potential to be a basketball player. But then it's just that because you're tall, doesn't mean that you're going to be a basketball player. Then you have to learn the name of the game. You have to learn, the role that you're going to play. You have to be physically whatever. So I think we should tell a child, you have the potential. You are really able to. But this means that you have a responsibility for. You have a responsibility for it to be nurtured and developed. It's the same way, if you have your new puppy, or, I just planted something.
He has a lot of potential, my new puppy.
But I just planted something in the garden, and when I bought it at the nursery, the person who sold it to me said, this has the potential to really, blossom, and if you feed it and make sure the light is, whatever. And he showed me a picture and said, look, it's going to look like this. So, yes, I think as long as we can help kids understand what it's not just sitting back and saying, I'm smart enough and I'll get it.
So yeah, it's that growth mindset piece. Right? It's like how you talk about it through the lens of growth mindset. And I think in third grade, they're still a little like, it's my son has this all the time, right? Because he knows I work in this world known as GATE, and he's heard me use that term and these different things. And then finally, it's just like a few weeks ago, one day, he's like, am I GATE? And I said, I don't know, what do you think? And then he was like, well, and he started talking about the way things he thinks about in school and different things. I said, well, I don't know, that sounds pretty good. What do you think? I just kept kind of talking about it in that way and talking about potential in that way. So it wasn't so much like, what's hard is when kids get the fixed mindset on it, right? When we say by accident, not because we weren't well intending, but that we say, well, it means you're smart. And then it's like, uh-oh, well, what if I struggle? What if I don't feel so smart in something? That means I became ungifted, or suddenly I'm not smart, suddenly I'm a failure. Like that becomes so close. So I always caution about the S word, right? Because it can become very, very sort of close-ended for our children.
We all have potential. Some of us have just more potential in some areas than others. And I'm not saying we're all gifted, and there are people who do believe that, and that's fine. But we all have potential, we all have talent, we all have some abilities. The question is, it's up to us to nurture it. I mean, how many of us were told when we were a kid, gee, you really write well, and did we pick up a pen and really write well? But we knew, it's really, more, I want kids to know that they have more control over this, and I want teachers to be more cognizant of what they say to a child, because
Could I talk to him about potential and, continue that growth without actually saying, by the way, you're GATE? Like, or do we have to say, hey, that test you took last year?
I don't think they remember the test. I mean, if they ask about it, but I don't know that they necessarily remember it in that way, Okay, I want to be able to get to the last thing you wanted to talk about, and then we'll see if we can get a question.
But I think from my standpoint, there's no reason to run from it. It is what it is. And so here are some of the things. And I'll go real fast, I promise. And that is that we need to have kids have a self-inventory enough. So when they go into a lesson, they know how they can use their ability. And so, I don't want to run away from the fact that some of us are better at doing some things than others. All of us have potential. But unless you have that self-inventory and know where it's going to be used, then sometimes you let it lie dormant. So here are some things to think about. One is that you can acknowledge your ability without being arrogant. One of the things that we need to be careful about is not that your child knows or doesn't know that he or she is gifted, but that they don't use it as a whipping stick or a social climbing ladder, that they understand its relative nature. And it is relative. It is relative. I mean, have you seen Dancing with the Stars when a football player can hardly pick up his legs to dance, yet ran a fabulous, fabulous run to the goal? I think we also need to help kids understand that it's a means and not an end. It's a means. It's in process. Because you know math today and get an A doesn't mean you're not going to know math tomorrow unless you put some ability behind it. And I think that, this is another really important issue. I think we need to help kids understand that you can share and monitor your ability without losing your identity. I see kids who are gifted who are so selfish, so selfish. They think that, if they're the only ones that can do it, that will, be that much better for them. And I don't want them to be a teacher. They don't have credentials. I don't want them to be abused. But I want them to understand that we learn from one another. And so you can learn from others and you can help others. And I want the kids desperately to understand that it's being a human, besides being academically successful. Do you know people that are really, really smart that you wouldn't even want to go to the movies with? Okay? And so, that kind of thing is something that you really want to help kids understand. And you want them to understand that a challenge is something that can be appreciating rather than depreciating. That it's not that we're trying to. One of the kids once said to me, which I will always remember, I think the teacher wants to take my giftedness away. And I said, well, why would the teacher want to do that? Because I think the teacher doesn't want me to be gifted because she wouldn't make the work that hard. So I think we need to help kids again, as we started this conversation this afternoon, or this evening, really looking at that we understand what a challenge is. And last of all, that, we can learn from others. I don't care how smart you are. There's some people that you can interact with and that you can learn from. And I think, just as an ending point, one of the things I think that we need to really look at is that regardless of how gifted your child is, giftedness does not mean that you abdicate your responsibility for that child. I mean, you're still in charge. There's lots of data that shows that many of our kids think that once they're smart enough to beat you at math, once they're smart, they can take over the money management. That's not what we're talking about. It's giftedness within that family unit, and it's the idea that we want to make sure that we all share in that. So I want to thank Karen very, very much for being here. It's nice to meet Julie and to see some of you that I've met in other places as well. And I hope that at least this has given you some fodder for thinking about things in another way about giftedness.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so we'll be here for a few seconds. Yeah, so thank you so much to everyone. Thank you for those of you who are watching from home. And thank you, Dr. Kaplan, so much for sharing this much of a vast body of knowledge, but hopefully gave you some things to think about. I always come away every time I listen to you speak with new things to think about in relation to my own child, as well as the children that I serve here in this district and the teachers that I serve and coaches that I serve here in this district. So thank you so much for being here.